Hi, my name is Jim Haw, and this is Life of Christ class, the first class. And we'll begin with prayer tonight, and then we'll head into the syllabus and talk about it. So God, thank you for bringing us here tonight, and thank you for your love for us and all that you give us. And Lord, as we take this weeks ahead to look at the life of Jesus Christ, his earthly life, would you just show us the things that you'd want us to learn from that, use it to apply it in our lives, our ministries, our ability to communicate to others the love that Jesus had and his earthly life, how he demonstrated his love and all that his earthly life represents to us, Lord, that you, God, would take time to come on earth and live among us. We just praise you for that, and thank you for given us a model for what it means to be a human in the true sense of the way you modeled it, Lord. So as we go through the course, as we learn about your the way you lived, help us to model our lives after you. We pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, if you will, take a look at your notes. We'll begin with the class syllabus, just go over the requirements for the course. I always talk about this being the time you get syllabus shock, this time of the year. So the basic course description is we're just going to take a detailed study of the aspects of Jesus' life on earth, looking at the chronology of his earthly life, some insights into his teaching, and then we'll talk some theological stuff about the work on the cross, what it really means, what does salvation really mean, what did his death on the cross do for us in a theological way. And we'll also talk about discipleship quite a bit. My approach to most of the YVBI classes that I teach is almost a hermeneutical approach, and probably most of you have not had hermeneutics yet, since this is one of the early courses. But hermeneutics is basically the science or the study of how to study the Bible, how to interpret the Bible. And so I like to approach every class I do as an opportunity to teach you some hermeneutical techniques. You'll have a whole class in hermeneutics. You'll get that intensively, but I think it's good to start in early on, and we'll look at a lot of scriptures. You'll need to bring your Bible each time we come to class, because we'll flip through the Bible and hopefully you'll be able to look at passages and say, I can understand this, and I can understand what Jesus is saying. So we'll deal with some of those aspects. Okay, let's just jump down to the course textbook. There's only one textbook other than your Bible that's required for the course, and that is Jesus the Messiah by Stein. I never keep my slip covers on. I always throw them away. So it's a really good little book as far as giving some historical data and some facts about the life of Christ, some of the cultural things that you would need to know as you read through the Gospels, and he talks about some of the tough things that dealing with discrepancies or differences between the different Gospels and how to handle them, and etc. So that's the only required textbook, and for audit students, it's I highly recommend it. It's not required for you, but highly recommend you picking it up. It'd be a good thing to have in your library. We'd like you to have a version of the Bible that's a modern translation or something that's not a paraphrase. Okay, NIV would be a great one, but most any translations would work for this. Just don't have it be a paraphrase like the Message or the Living Bible or one of those. Okay. As far as attendance requirements are concerned, attendance is mandatory. Is this basically standard YVBI practice? Absences will impact your grade. For those of you who are audit students that have never taken a YVBI class, you can listen to as much of this as you want, and you can ignore as much of it as you want. Okay, you paid the dollars to make the decision of how much you want to get out of this. So most of what I'm saying is for those who are taking it for credit. If you miss more than 3 hours or any portion thereof, you will not receive a course grade higher than a B. If you miss more than 6 hours or any portion of that, you will not receive a course grade higher than a C. Now, please don't think to yourself, oh, I can skip one whole day and still end up with an A, okay? Because you never know. You may skip a day and then you get sick or somebody dies in your family the next week or somewhere in the course and you've got to be gone and that's going to knock you down. So don't think of that as a silver bullet. Just be here, okay? Reading. 15% of your grade is based on the reading, and there's a reading schedule in your syllabus on page 4. And you can look at the different weeks and see what needs to be read when. For example, by next week when you come here, you will have to have read the Gospel according to Mark and the first 2 chapters of Stein. Okay, the reading is a little heavier up the first 4 weeks because you're reading through the 4 Gospels. It gets a little easier as you go through the rest of the course. At the end of the course, I'll have you sign a piece of paper. Actually, it's on page 6 of your syllabus, saying that you've read, and sign off that you've read it on time, or you were late getting it read, or you didn't get it read, and you'll give yourself a grade on that. Okay. 25% of your grade is going to be based on a Life of Christ notebook, and here's what I mean by that. What I want you to do is, in the course of the class, start assembling a 3-ring notebook of materials dealing with the life of Christ. It can include your class notes. You're going to end up writing a paper at the end. You can include your paper in that. Any research you've done to do your paper, make photocopies, stick it in there. Get maps, anything that would help you. I mean, you can get on the internet and go hog wild, probably. What I'm looking for is, when it's all said and done, when you're done with this class, I want you to have something for your library that deals with the life of Jesus. That's organized, and it's going to be a tool that you can use the rest of your life, that you say, hey, trying to remember what I learned in that class. You can pull that notebook out and find the information, okay? So it's a tool for you, and you can share. If you find something good and you can share it with each other, I don't care. You know, this is the one thing in your class that you can share with others, okay? I don't want you writing each other's papers, but if you find something good for your notebook, feel free to let other people know where you found it so that they can get it for their notebook too. Your grade will be based on the effort you've put into assembling your notebook, the content that's in it, how it's organized, and the perceived usefulness of the notebook. It's due at the second to the last class. And the only reason I have you give it to the second to last class is so I can grade it and get it back to you. And it's not all, everything's not just due the last day of class. Okay. 25% of your grade will be based on class participation and discussions. Periodically, I'll have break into small groups or around tables and discuss something, or we'll have some just interaction as a class. And to the extent that you participate in that and contribute, your grade will be based on that. And normally I will have you fill out a little form at the end of that saying, yeah, this is what I participated in, this is my contribution to my little group, you know. And you'll be your own evaluator on that. Plus I'll evaluate you by observation. The big part of your grade, 35%, is a research paper that you'll write. It'll be due the last day of class. It is a research paper, and it's to research some detail. It's to detail some aspects of Christ's teaching, his life, his ministry, something that would be consistent with what's covered in this class. Dealing with Jesus' earthly life, okay? Not some other theological thing out there that doesn't have a lot to do with the life of Jesus on earth, okay? It needs to deal with that. For example, you might want to write, you might have all your life read that Jesus told certain people, don't tell anybody what I just did to you. I just healed you. Don't go tell anybody. And you ask yourself, why didn't he want that person to go tell anybody, but this person he didn't seem to mind? It's a great thing to do a research paper on, research that, figure out what that is. And so you might, if you decide to do a paper like that, you might come to the conclusion as you do your research, and I don't know if this is a good conclusion or not, but I'm just throwing it out there, that perhaps your thesis of your paper would be, well, Jesus forbade the blind blind men from telling about their healing because he didn't want the publicity. That might be your thesis statement, and you write your paper on that. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. If there's a teaching, maybe there's a parable that you say, hey, I'd like to know what he really meant by this parable and what he meant to his audience when he told that parable. You can do research and write about the parable. Okay? You may ask, another example might be, why did Jesus always refer to himself as the Son of Man? What did he mean by that? It'd be a great paper to write. Okay? Here's what I don't want you to do in your paper. Don't preach at me. Don't draw conclusions. I want you to keep it in the historical context of the day. All right? In other words, don't tell me how it applies to me, okay, or how it applies to you. Talk about what Jesus did and what he meant by what he did, okay, and keep it in the past tense in a sense, as far as historically, right? What happens is we tend to, because of our training, our Bible studies that we've been in all our lives, we want to when we read our Bibles and have devotions, the first thing we want to do is jump to application. What does this mean to me? And we haven't taken enough time to say, what did it mean to them? And I want you to stay back with what did it mean to them? Stay back in the historical time and figure that out. Spend more time understanding that. And there'll be plenty of time later, not in this class, but some other class, to draw application to today. All right, we're a lot better at that than we are understanding what he meant back then. Okay. The term paper should be 6 to 8 pages, typed, double-spaced, with an acceptable 12-point font. Don't give me some fancy font. All right, just give me one font. Don't bold anything. Don't pretend you're using a typewriter. Okay, and if you have to do something with a font that a typewriter wouldn't do it, don't do it. Okay, I don't want anything flashy. I don't want it shaded or three-dimensional or anything like that. Just give me a flat term paper. Like does anybody know what a typewriter is anymore? Okay. Anyway, it should be 6 to 8 pages long. It has to have a formal bibliography listing at least 5 scholarly sources. These sources must be scholarly in nature, and as opposed to devotional. Like Chuck Swindoll. Chuck Swindoll would be a devotional. Most of what he writes is devotional. Okay, it's good stuff, but he's taken other scholars' stuff and he's putting it in a sermon and giving you a sermon in a book. Basically, it's more devotional. It's already, he's borrowing from other scholars. You want to find the scholars and see what they have to say. Commentaries, that type of stuff. Okay. And if you have questions as you go along about is this a scholarly source or not, ask me. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about that and maybe give you some suggestions. So you need at least 5 of those. Your textbook can be one of them if there's something in there that pertains to your particular area of research. We'll need footnotes, not endnotes, but footnotes in a formal format that references those scholarly sources, plus a bibliography at the end. Now, if you've never written that type of paper, pick up Kate Turabian's A Manual for Writers, okay? Kate Turabian gives you basically what you need to know to write term papers using the Chicago Manual of Style as a guide, all right? And you don't necessarily have to pick up this book, but this is the style we use throughout YVBI, and I'm one of the professors that I'm dogmatic about it. I'll mark your paper down if your footnotes aren't exactly the way they should be. Okay, so and trust me, people are able to figure it out. Get online, or you can get on the website and do a Google search of Chicago Manual of Style, and you'll have all sorts of sites to go to figure out how to write that way. How to footnote things, how to reference things. What's the difference between referencing a book versus a magazine article, etc. Or a commentary set with a multi-volume commentary set with a general editor. It gets footnoted differently than a book with just one author, that type of thing. And you just need to, look it up and find out how to do that. It also tells you how to write a cover page on here, in there. And I'll expect a cover page, etc. Now, a term paper proposal must be submitted to me in writing, outlining the topic of your paper at midterm. And here's what I want. I want a brief one-sentence thesis from you by midterm. Kind of like the one-sentence thesis I wrote at the bottom of page 2 in your syllabus there. Jesus forbid the blind men from telling about their healing because he did not want the publicity. That's a one-sentence thesis statement. It tells you what you're going to write about. And it gives you basically the conclusion of your research. All right? And that thesis statement is very, very important because once you have a thesis statement, you can write your paper and everything is focused on that thesis statement. Because what happens when I grade your paper, I'm going to be looking for a thesis statement in your first paragraph. Okay? And I'm going to say, oh, there's this thesis right there. You don't have to tell me what it is. I can figure it out by reading your first paragraph. And then as I read your paper, that's going to be my roadmap to know what you're going to be writing about. And if you start chasing rabbits and get off your thesis, then that's going to hurt your paper. But a thesis statement will focus your paper and make it so much easier to write. All right? A thesis is not a question. Make sure you hear that. A thesis statement is not a question. It's the answer to the question. Okay? In other words, a thesis isn't why did Jesus not want anybody to know that he healed them. That's not a thesis statement. The thesis is the answer to that question. Does that make sense? And I will want your thesis statement by midterm, which means you're going to have to do some research before midterm so that you know what you're writing about and you've already drawn some conclusion, enough to form a thesis statement. Okay? Now I understand that as you then finish off your paper, your thesis statement might evolve a little bit as you do more research and you start formulating your thoughts and stuff. That's fine, but I don't want you to wait a week before it's due to say, oh my stars, I don't know what I'm going to write about. Okay, I'm really trying to help you out by midterm having you nail down what you're going to write about, because it'll make it a lot easier the rest of the second half. Okay, and it's a one sentence. That one sentence ideally ought to be about 15 words, give or take. If it gets more than 20 words, it's too wordy. I don't want compound sentences with lots of semicolons, It's a brief sentence, okay, about 15 words. The more narrow you make it, the easier it'll be for you. Let me just give you some things. You might want to jot these little do's and don'ts down. It's a formal research paper, so please write it in third person. He, she, it, not I or you or we. Don't say, I think this, I think that, or we should do this. That's not a formal way of writing. Use third person, okay? He, she, it. Don't say I. If you use the words I, we, or you, you're writing in first or second person, all right? Don't do that. So, trust me, a couple of you will, okay? And it'll hurt your paper. Don't use contractions. Can't. It's cannot. Those things are just, think formal paper. Whatever it takes to write a formal paper. Things I'm going to be grading your paper on are the style. Does it include, style includes grammar, syntax. Syntax is how words are put together to form sentences. Punctuation, proper citing of sources, footnoting, and bibliography. I'll also be grading you on the quality of scholarly sources and your interaction with those sources, okay? And here's what I want you to do. I want you to interact with the sources. I don't want you just saying so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that, so-and-so says this, and then going on to the next paragraph. Tell me if you agree with it or not. You don't have to say, I agree with so-and-so, because that's using first person, but you can write that in a way that you're interacting with that source. You don't have to agree with the source. If you don't agree with them, tell me why that source doesn't seem to be on track. Tell me, give me your thoughts. Don't just list a bunch of other people's opinions. Tell me what they think and tell me why you think differently or you agree with them. either one. So interact with them. And I love it when you get to the point where you can argue with the scholars. You know, when you get to that point where you're arguing with the scholars, then you're on to something. And that's a great place to be. Okay. You want to be careful how often you do that. But you'll notice as you start doing research and with biblical scholars and commentaries, they don't all agree with each other. Okay. So. Content. I'll grade you on your content, whether or not you have a clear thesis and you develop that thesis, how well you lay out your thesis and how well thought out your argument is on that. Don't stray away from that. Don't preach at me. It's not a sermon or devotional, so don't write a sermon manuscript for me, okay? You'll have time to do that when you take the preaching seminar, if you ever do. And papers are due by the due date, which is the last day of class. If any paper that's late we'll lose our letter grade for every day, okay? And if it's due on a Tuesday night, that means by Wednesday it's already a B automatically. The highest you can get is a B. If you turned it in on Thursday, the highest you can get is a C. Okay, so just get it in on time. All right, page 4 of the syllabus. If you look, you'll see the class deadlines there for the different weeks of the class. The reading schedule is the first thing, and then you'll see that the term paper proposal deadline is week 5. And you basically submit those in writing. It's better if you type it up so I can read it, okay? And, give me your 5 sources, or at least 5 that you're thinking about using. Okay, you may end up using more later. That's fine, but you need to come up with 5 sources. And, if you could type them up in bibliographical form, that way you'll get a head start on that, learn how to do that. Get that to me, and I'll get it back to you by the next week to let you know whether that's a good proposal or not. The notebook is due week 9, and then your term paper is due week 10. And if you look on page 5, if you're interested in where we're headed with the course as far as what are we going to cover when, you can look at the different weeks and see what we're covering, and we'll stick pretty close to that. All right, let me just take a moment and stop and ask if there's any questions on the syllabus at all. Please feel free to ask any questions on the paper or anything. All right, let's move into the actual course on page 1 of your notes, the introduction to the Gospels. I'm going to start with what's kind of boring, I think, for some people, and maybe even a little shocking if you've never been exposed to scholarly debates about who wrote different books of the Bible. I remember when I went through seminary and found out that there were people who didn't actually believe that Paul wrote all the letters that Paul wrote. There are scholars that believe differently. I was shocked and wondered why in the world I moved my family across the country to come to this liberal seminary. But yet they were exposing me to scholarly thinking. Whether it was right or wrong, it was good to engage it because it forced me to think, okay, what do I believe and why do I believe it? And so there might be some things I say in this course that you're going to say, oh, I'm not even sure that guy's a Christian, Trust me, I am. I'm probably about as conservative as there is, but I don't mind engaging the scholars in debating them, okay? And you need to be exposed a little bit to what they think, and so that you can form your own arguments for or against what they're saying. And so we'll start off with some of that right now with talking about the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So let's just jump right in with Matthew and start with the question, who wrote Matthew? We don't know who wrote Matthew. The book is entitled Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, but remember the title of the book is not part of the inspired, inerrant Word of God. Those are titles that were added later, okay? There's nothing in the actual book that says Matthew wrote it, all right? So it's not mentioned anywhere in the text. Most current scholars doubt whether Matthew the apostle wrote the gospel. And we'll discuss some reasons for that a little later when we talk about the 4-source theory. But in the early church, there's strong tradition that Matthew did write the gospel. The early church affixed the title of Matthew to the gospel as early as 125 AD. And I think that has to hold a certain amount of weight. If the early church believed it was from Matthew, then we have to give it some serious consideration whether Matthew wrote it, favoring the fact that maybe Matthew wrote it. Of course, we know Matthew is one of the 12 disciples, apostles of Christ. He was a tax collector who is most likely, though, also called Levi. Let's take your Bibles and let's look at a couple passages here. Look at Matthew 9 and 12. 9 through 12. So on page 993. That's humor. It's poor humor, but it's about as good as you get from me. Notice what Matthew's, and then what I want you to do is turn to Mark 2. You don't need to turn to the Luke. It's pretty much the same as the Mark account. But look at Mark chapter 2, verse 13. Okay, as I'm reading the Matthew account, maybe you can watch the the Mark account and just follow along, okay, and look at the close similarity, but also notice the differences. So Matthew 9, verses 9 through 12 says this: As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many of the tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "How does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Or why does he eat? Not how, but why does he eat? On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Now, if you were following along in the Mark account, you would notice that it's very, very similar. The major difference is what? Not Matthew, but Levi. All right? Now, so because they're so close and similar, we almost have to say, most scholars would agree, Matthew and Levi are the same person. And, back in those days, many of them had two different names, especially Christians. They would have their Hebrew name, and then they would take a different name when they became Christians. Saul and Paul would be an example of that. Cephas, Peter. Cephas and Peter, that's kind of basically the same name. It's just two different languages. Cephas being Aramaic, Peter being the Greek word for the name for the same meaning. Okay. But some scholars would look at the fact that Matthew uses the name Matthew as opposed to Levi, where Mark and Luke have Levi, and they would say that's internal evidence that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew, because he used the name he wanted to use here. That's trying really hard to make a case, and it may or may not be true. It's just really, it's not conclusive one way or the other. But what I mean by there's a difference between internal evidence and external evidence, and you'll hear these words tonight. Internal evidence is evidence that you can glean from the scriptures themselves. External evidence would be what other people say outside the Bible. Okay, like early Christian writings talked about Matthew being the author of Matthew. They attributed Matthew as the author. That's external. The fact that he calls himself Matthew here might be internal evidence that Matthew wrote the book. Many scholars believe that the title Matthew was attached to the gospel more to make it authoritative than because Matthew actually wrote it. In other words, if they can attach an apostle's name to it, it sounds authoritative. We only want in scriptures those books that were written by apostles or written by those who were closely associated with the apostles. That was one of the ways of thinking. So by saying Matthew wrote this, that takes care of that problem. Okay. Now, I don't know who wrote the book of Matthew, and I really don't care that much who wrote the book of Matthew. I know that that God in His sovereignty had it included in the Scriptures. And there's another YVBI class that I teach, more a second year class, that we talk about how the Bible came together. So I'm not going to spend time in this course talking about that. But even though I'm not sure who wrote the book of Matthew, for the sake of this class, I will refer to Matthew as the author of Matthew. Okay, I probably lean toward Matthew having written it because, again, the early church leaned in that direction. When was Matthew written? That's a hard question too. Scholars differ greatly depending on who you think wrote the book. I mean, if you think Matthew wrote it, then you have to go for an earlier date because he has to have written it before he dies, you know. If he was an apostle, one of Jesus' apostles, they can't have written it in 120 AD. You know, he'd be pretty old by then, okay? Matthew, I'm going to say Matthew was written probably somewhere around 80 to 100 AD. This date would follow after the fall of Jerusalem that occurred around 70 AD. We're going to talk about the fall of Jerusalem quite a bit as kind of a historical milestone for us to kind of gauge things on a timeline. Did they happen before 70 AD or after? In 70 AD, the Zealots and those who were rebelling against the Romans, the Israelites that rebelled against the Romans, revolted big time, and the Romans came in. They destroyed the temple and basically drove the Jews out of the Palestine area. And so that's kind of a milestone there, the 70 AD. Second century documents refer to Matthew, so its date can't be too late. Okay, it has to be no later than early second century if other books are going to refer to it. You know, it has to have time for it to become authoritative in their minds that they would even reference it. Okay, so a date around 80 to 100 AD is probably a pretty good guess. Now, who Matthew was writing to is a little easier to guess. When you look at the book of Matthew, it seems that his audience was Jewish people. He wrote the book for other Jewish people. Because one of his purposes is to show how the major events in Jesus' life were in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Over and over again, he refers to Old Testament prophecies and points out how Jesus fulfilled that. Well, if you were writing to Gentiles, why would you care about doing that? It wouldn't be that important. But to Jews, if you're writing to Jewish people and you're trying to convince them that Jesus was their Messiah, that would be very important. Let's move on to Mark. Strong Christian testimony exists that Mark indeed was the author of Mark. But again, it's one of those books we don't know from the book itself who wrote it, because it doesn't say in the text that Mark, wrote this. But the early church witness of the fact that Mark wrote it, and really scholars haven't seen any reason to not think that. Now, who is Mark? Well, Mark was believed to be the same Mark that's referred to in Luke as the nephew of Barnabas, also known as John or John Mark. If you remember the stories in in Acts, did I say Exodus earlier? I really do know my order of the books of the Bible. In Acts, you remember Paul and Barnabas go on their one missionary journey, and their first missionary journey, and they took Mark with them. And again, Mark's the nephew of Barnabas. And something happened during that journey that Mark bailed on him. He went home. He left. And that didn't set very good, apparently, with Paul. So when they were planning their second missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas said, let's take Mark with us again. And Paul said, no, I don't want to take Mark with us because he bailed the first time. I don't want that to happen. And they argued about it. And the Bible says there was a pretty good dispute rose between them, and so much so that they parted ways. Paul took some guys and went one way, and Barnabas took Mark and went in a different way. And we don't really know much about what happened to Barnabas' missionary trip, but the book of Acts records Paul's second missionary journey extensively. Apparently, Mark proved himself to Paul over time, as we see several positive references to Paul's letters to Mark's usefulness. We see that in Colossians, 2 Timothy, and Philemon. We also see Mark associated with Peter during Peter's early ministry in Jerusalem in the book of Acts. In 1 Peter 5:13, Mark affectionately is referred to as Peter's son. So apparently Mark, in later years, turned out to be a pretty useful person to both Paul and to Peter, and redeemed himself. Most scholars think that Mark really was a disciple of Peter, very close associate of Peter, so that when Peter died or was martyred, because the story is that Peter was martyred in Rome, that's what we believe happened to him, at least that's what tradition tells us. Scholars are thinking that Mark probably wrote the Gospel of Mark right after Peter's death, because he said, here's a guy, Peter's dead, his stories are going to die unless I get them down on paper. And so he gets them down on paper. So if Mark was not an eyewitness of Jesus' life, he was closely associated with those who were, Peter specifically. Many believe that Mark wrote the Gospel shortly after Peter's death to preserve the oral record he received from Mark. Now I wanted to point out one little passage for you to kind of chew on a little bit. Mark chapter 14, verse 51. Here's what scholars do when they're trying to find some little nuggets of internal evidence to try to make an argument that Mark wrote the book of Mark. If you look at Mark 14, verse 51, it's probably a passage you remember. It's only recorded in Mark. It says this. Is when Jesus is being arrested. Hopefully I get the right chapter here. 14, verse 51. It says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Now, scholars look at that and say, now why would Mark record that? Unless maybe he was the guy, So some believe that is, Mark's way of saying that was me, And I don't think I want to go any further with that. Okay. Now, when was Mark written? Well, if our theory is right that Mark was a disciple of Peter and he wrote it shortly after Peter's death, then most scholars would say that would probably happen before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. We know that Peter was martyred in Rome about 65 AD. So somewhere between 65 and 70 AD seems to be a logical guess as to when it was written. Again, it's a guess, okay? We can't be certain. But if you look at Mark chapter 13, verse 14. We got your Bibles. This is Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse that we'll talk about in following weeks here. But Jesus is explaining the signs of the end times, or etc. And he says, when you see, again, Mark 13, verse 14, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Okay, and what Jesus is doing here is quoting from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, which is a fairly well-known prophecy that has been seen, even in Jesus' days as being somewhat apocalyptic in nature, dealing with end times. And if you look at, as we look at Luke a little later, Luke will take the same passage and he'll change the words. He won't say the abomination that causes desolation. He'll say when you see the soldiers standing where they're not supposed to be, type of thing. And so what scholars seem to think here is that Mark quotes Jesus the way he said it, and he wrote this before 70 AD, before the temple fell. And most people would believe that that prophecy from Daniel at least has one of its fulfillments in 70 AD when the temple was desecrated by the Romans and then completely destroyed. But Luke wrote after 70 AD, and because he knew the historical circumstances that the Roman soldiers came in, he changed the word "the abomination which causes desolations" to when you see the soldiers standing where they shouldn't be, in the temple. And so that's evidence that Mark was before 70 AD, Luke was after 70 AD. So that's how the argument goes. Okay? Again, all those things, again, this is kind of the hermeneutical thing I want to expose you to in this class, is that scholars have lots of opinions and they kind of form them based on little teeny nuggets that are kind of iffy, but yet they try to come up with some logical conclusions based on that. And they may be right, but there's no guarantee that they are. All right. Mark's audience appears to be Gentiles. Mark probably was with Peter in Rome when Peter was martyred. Perhaps the Gentiles in Rome were his audience. Evidence to support this assertion includes the following. There's translations of several Aramaic words in Mark's gospel. Now keep in mind that Aramaic was probably the language that Jesus spoke in most of the time. And we see that when he was on the cross, he spoke some Aramaic words. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Remember that? That's Aramaic, okay? Then he spoke like Abba, Father. Abba is an Aramaic word meaning father or dad, or, kind of a term of endearment. So let's look at Mark chapter 5, verse 41, just to give you an example. Mark quotes an Aramaic word out of Jesus' mouth, but then he translates it. If he was writing to a Jewish audience in the Judean area or the Palestine area, he wouldn't have needed to really translate it, okay, because they would have understood it. But apparently Mark is writing to Gentiles who don't know Aramaic, so he's translating what the word means. So this is the story where Jesus heals the young child that's has gotten sick, and he says, he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Notice how Mark translates the Aramaic there, which is this internal evidence saying that more than likely Mark's audience were not Jewish people that knew Aramaic, but they were probably Gentiles that did not know Aramaic. And there's several other examples I've given you there. Mark also has a limited number of references to the Old Testament prophecies. This points to the fact that the Jews were probably not his primary audience. He wasn't so concerned with showing that Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy, because his audience really wasn't going to be clamoring for that, so to speak. Okay, let's look at Luke then. The author of Luke is also unknown. We don't know. It doesn't tell us who wrote it. The early church said that Luke did, but there's nothing in the gospel itself. We do know that the author was not an eyewitness of the life of Jesus. He actually tells us that. He writes at the very beginning of Luke, he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. That little phrase right there indicates that he was not one of those eyewitnesses. Okay? Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account to you, O excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Okay? The author of Luke most certainly was also the author of Acts, because he begins the book of Acts in a very similar way. He says, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions to the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. So the book of Luke and the book of Acts seem to be two volumes of a work by one man written to another man named Theophilus. Because of the first person language used in the narrative of Acts, it appears that the author was a traveling companion of Paul. And one person I read, one scholar said that if you look at the book of Acts and you look at how all the traveling companions of Paul are named except for two of them. And one would be Titus and the other one would be Luke. And nobody's ever considered Titus as being a logical choice for the author of Acts, so that kind of leaves Luke. Luke is the traditionally accepted author of the early church. Luke was a physician, as we know, so he was highly educated. Just recently, for my Greek class that I teach, I've been working on translating a passage in the book of Acts from the Greek. And the language, the vocabulary, and the syntax of how he phrases, puts sentence together is so much more complicated than like the book of Matthew, that it's very apparent that, at least to me, in my, I'm not a scholar in Greek, but it's so much more difficult to translate that you have to say this person that wrote this was a very learned person, and Greek was his native language, because he can write really complicated. Where, like Matthew, where Greek was a secondary language, his Greek is very basic and very easy to translate for a novice like myself. Okay, so that to me is kind of internal evidence that a highly educated person like a doctor might have written the book of Luke. Okay. Most scholars believe that Luke was written in the latter part of the first century, around 90 A.D. Many believe that Luke relied heavily on Mark as a source. If that is true, then Luke must have written after Mark had been written and had become authoritative. And we're going to look at the four-source theory here in a second as to what we mean by Luke borrowing from Mark. But Luke says right in the beginning of his gospel that he researched. He obviously borrowed a lot of information from a lot of sources and compiled it and tried to separate fact from fiction and to put together an orderly account of Jesus' life. And as you look at Mark and you look at Luke, you say he must have either borrowed from Mark or he borrowed from the same source that Mark was borrowing from. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a moment. His audience. The audience of Luke is clearly stated to be Theophilus. Theophilus is really a compound word. It appears to be a name, but it could be just a compound word, theo meaning God. Philos, is where we get Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Philos is love in Greek. So God lover or God fearer, you could translate it that way. The very fact that there's a most excellent in front of that seems to make it appear to be a title. So it's probably a proper name, Theophilus, as opposed to a description of this person. Okay. So excellent Theophilus indicates that he was a Gentile of a certain social status, social rank. Most likely he was a Gentile convert to Christ with some yet incomplete instruction that Luke felt like he needed to get Theophilus up to speed on. Some believe that Theophilus was a God-fearer, and that was just a term used to describe Gentiles who had converted to Judaism. They were referred to as God-fearers. I tell you what, let's take a break, and then we'll pick up at John and talk about it. Okay, let's pick up at John. So I'm on the bottom of page 4 in your notes. Let's talk about who wrote John. The internal evidence and church tradition suggests that John, the apostle, wrote John. Some of the evidence is listed here in the notes. The author uses the first person pronoun, I, in chapter 1. That indicates that the author was an eyewitness. Okay. Passages such as John 19, verse 35, and John 21, verse 24 and 25 add to the argument that the author was an eyewitness. Let's look at those. John 19. Excuse me. in verse 35. And you're going to want to just keep your Bible open in this area here for a little while because we'll be back and forth there. John chapter 19, verse 35 says, "The man who saw this," maybe I should back up. I always hate to read a verse out of context because that's really bad hermeneutics too. Okay, so let's back up to verse 31. "Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe." Okay, so that's the author's way of saying I was an eyewitness there. And then if you jump over to verse 20 or chapter 21, we'll back it up to verse 20 there. It says, "Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, 'Lord, who is going to betray you?' When Peter saw him, he asked, 'Lord, what about him?'" Remember this, Jesus has been talking to Peter about the kind of death that Peter would experience. And so as Peter looks at the disciple that Jesus loved, he said, "What about him? How's he going to die?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the brothers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. So that seems to indicate, that verse 24 there, seems to indicate that the one who wrote this Gospel of John is the one who is referred to in the Gospel as the disciple that Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple. So who is this beloved disciple? Okay. Well, we get a little more hint of that when we look at the first 7 verses of chapter 21. Because there we see that the choice gets narrowed down for us somewhat. So this is after Jesus' resurrection, and he is meeting his disciples at the Sea of Galilee. Okay. So afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, which is Galilee. And it happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, which would be James and John, right? And 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but his disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. Okay, so we know by those verses that the disciple whom Jesus loved, who apparently is the writer of the gospel, was with them on this scene. And he named all the people who were there. It was Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John, Peter, and 2 other disciples. So we know it's not Peter, right? It would make sense that the beloved disciple would be talking to himself here. So we know it's not Peter, so it's either Thomas, Nathanael, James, John, or one of the 2 other disciples, which are not named. The very fact that he's called the disciple that Jesus loved seems to indicate that he was a part of Jesus' inner circle. And several times in the Gospels we see Jesus taking Peter, James, and John into a really tight inner circle to show them things that he didn't show the other disciples. So because of that, most people, we know it's not Peter. That narrows it down to James and John, and John is the one that's traditionally considered to be the author. Okay? If John or some other apostle wrote the Gospel of John, then a date no later than about 85 to 90 AD would make sense. Can't get too late because they're getting kind of old, all right? John's audience appears to be Gentile audience because throughout the Gospel he's explaining Jewish customs to the audience. He's translating Jewish names. He's helping them locate, identifying where the location is of different Palestine sites. So all that indicates it would be somebody who's unfamiliar with the Palestine area, like a Gentile from the outside, or maybe even a Jewish person that was not living in Palestine, had not grown up in Palestine. Okay, now what I want to do is talk about the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels because they have a common viewpoint of things. If you've read the Gospels, which I'm sure you have before, as you read them you say, boy, there's some real similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But then you get to John and it's like totally different perspective, different order of things, different stories, different parables. There's very little overlap in John that other than the major events of his crucifixion and stuff that you will see. You don't get any of the early childhood stuff. You don't get a very detailed description of the Lord's Supper in John. You get allusions to it, but it doesn't actually say this was the Last Supper, this was Passover, etc. But in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's lots of parallels, lots of almost word-for-word verses in there. So scholars have looked at that and said they are known as the Synoptic Gospels because of their similarity. And there's a theory that has risen among scholars as to how Matthew, Mark, and Luke came about. Okay, now this is a theory. I'm going to present it to you. I do not necessarily buy into the theory. I don't discard it out of hand either. I'm just not really sure what to do with it, but I'm giving it to you because when you read scholars in the commentaries and you're going to hear them talk about these things. This four-source theory is also called the Q-source theory. And you just need to be familiar with it so that you can understand what the scholars are talking about. Okay, the four-source theory says that Mark was the first book that was written. And he probably didn't borrow from a lot of sources because he had Peter as his primary source. And then it says that Matthew and Luke borrowed extensively from Mark. About 90% of Mark is found in Matthew, almost verbatim. And about 50% of Mark is found in Luke. And if you combine what's in Matthew and Mark and Luke, all the verses that are in Matthew and Luke that are also in Mark, there's only a few verses left in Mark that aren't found in one of these two. Okay? And again, many of them are almost word for word verbatim. And you say, okay, how do I deal with that? And you could get real spiritual and say that's because the Holy Spirit inspired them to write exactly the same words. But logic says that, to me, logic says, that doesn't really answer the question fully. Right? Now, there's a lot in Matthew and Luke that are exactly the same, almost exactly the same, that is not found in Mark. And so what scholars say is well, they borrowed from another source, and we're going to call that the Q source. Q. Don't get Star Trek-y on me, okay? Q is not the guy in Star Trek, okay? Q basically comes from the German word Quell. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, which means source. But they're saying that Matthew and Luke must have had a common source outside of Mark because they have some commonality between themselves that you don't see in Mark. So they must have had a common source. Now, Q is just it's just a designation of a common source. Now that common source could be a multiple of sources that they both borrowed from. It might not have just been one source. It could have been a bunch of oral traditions that were passed down by Christians, and so they, they borrowed from those sources. Does that make sense? Q may not necessarily be one source. It could be a multiple sources that they both drew from. What she's asking is since Matthew, if we say Matthew, the apostle wrote Matthew, it really bothers us to think, why would Matthew have to borrow from Mark, who wasn't an apostle, to get his information? That's the tough issue. And could it be that Matthew was the source of Luke, since they shared some things in common? Well, scholars have asked themselves that question, and they tend to say no, because Luke is much more chronologically ordered than Matthew is. Why would somebody borrowing something that's less chronological put it in a more chronological order? Doesn't make sense. It's not impossible, but it's not probable. Okay, so they say there seems to they had a common outside source. Now there's information in Matthew that is unique to Matthew, like Matthew's genealogy, or Matthew's, there's some stories in Matthew that you're not going to find in any of the other three. So we say, okay, that comes from the M source, the Matthew source, whatever list of sources he used. And then there's stuff that's in Luke that's unique to Luke, like the account of the Annunciation of Jesus' birth to Mary, and the whole story about Elizabeth and all that. That's only in Luke. Okay, so Luke got that information from the L source. And the L source could be a multiple of sources, but they're sources that only Luke gleaned from. That's basically the four-source theory in a nutshell, all right? And I just want you to be aware of it. I'm not asking you to buy into it and accept it as being gospel truth. I'm not even sure where I stand on that. I think it makes a lot of sense. But if I want to hold that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew, I really have trouble with this four-source theory, because it almost forces you to say that Matthew isn't the author of Matthew. Okay? But to me, it's not really as important who wrote the book of Matthew. What's important is that God, in his divine sovereignty, made sure it was included in the completed canon of Scripture. Okay, now, when we have four sources of Jesus' story, basically four stories of Jesus coming from four different perspectives, we're going to have differences between the different gospel accounts. Sometimes those differences seem to conflict with each other, and we'll point some of those things out as we go along. But we've got to right up front talk about what are we going to do when we find that Matthew doesn't agree with Luke. They seem to contradict each other, or John doesn't seem to jive with the synoptic gospels. How are we going to deal with that? Are we going to be challenged in our faith? Are we going to say, well, the Bible's not true, therefore I throw it out the window? Are we going to say, no, there must be an explanation, a logical explanation? And I would say, yes, that's what we got to do. We have to say, there's got to be an explanation. If I can figure out an explanation, then I'm going to try to figure it out. If I can't, I'm going to just trust that in the mind of God, he knows the answer, why there's a conflict, and just live with that tension. And it's sometimes there's some tensions that you're going to have to live with when you're dealing with studying of the Scriptures that are just there. Okay, otherwise you're just always going to be challenged, all right, and your faith is going to be stretched hard if you don't accept that. Some things I just don't know this side of heaven, but I will know on the other side. There's enough things I know that are true that I can hang my faith on. Some things that seem to be in conflict, I'm going to trust that there's a logical explanation for that. So let's talk about some of that and how we're going to deal with that. Well, before we actually deal with conflicts, there's a couple things I want us to think of. When you read the Gospels, you have to think on three levels. Okay? First of all, the first level is just kind of the general big picture level. That is, God has given us the story of Jesus in four different accountings. And we can take all four of those accountings as a whole, put them together in synthesize them in our brain and get a picture of what Jesus' life looks like. Okay? And he gave us 4 different accounts in order for us to get 4 full perspectives so that we get this full developed understanding of Jesus' life. You know, if 4 of you were standing on 4 different corners of a street and saw a car accident, and the police each pulled you into their cruiser and interviewed you about what you saw, you would come up with 4 different accounts. There would be a lot of similarities, but there would be a lot of differences, and you would say something that you wouldn't say, you know, because you saw something from your perspective that the other person didn't. And your perspective could be influenced by where you were standing, what your mood was, you know, whether you got good glasses or bad glasses, or, you know, etc., you know. And so that's how the Gospels are. We have 4 different accountings of Jesus' life, and each one of those Gospel writers are writing to a different audience. So on one level, we think of the Gospels as a whole. All 4 of them, God put them together to give us a big picture of Jesus for us. And he did it that way. So that we need to look at Jesus' life from that perspective. On a second level, we need to examine each scene in a particular gospel. And a scene, typically the scholars call that a pericope. It's a fancy word. It's not periscopy, but it's pericope. And I don't use that term to show off my vocabulary, because I have a really limited vocabulary in English. I think Christopher has a better one, actually. And he doesn't live in the United States. So. Anyway, a pericope is, you know, what the scholars call a scene or a setting. For example, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is a pericope. It's a scene where Jesus is on this mountain and he's giving a sermon. Okay? Now, we have to think on the second level we have to think about is, okay, who is Jesus addressing in that scene? Who is his audience, and what is he communicating to them? So on one level we have, what is God communicating to us by giving us 4 Gospels? But then we go to a different level and say, what is Jesus saying to his immediate audience in this particular gospel, in this particular scene? And then a third level is, what is the gospel writer trying to communicate to his audience? Not to me, but to his audience. Matthew is writing to, let's say, Jews, because it seems to be who he's writing to. What is he trying to communicate to them? So you have 3 different levels that you have to think on when you're dealing with understanding the Gospels. Let me give you an example. Let's look at the example of the genealogy of Christ found in Matthew and found in Luke. If you look at Matthew's genealogy, which is the very first part of Matthew, it starts, well, in fact, let's just turn there, Matthew chapter 1. Now, who is Matthew's audience again? Apparently was Jews, okay? Now, what would, if you were thinking about it, if you were trying to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, how far back in the genealogy would you need to go? To David for certain, because they expected the Messiah to be the son of David. And you probably would even go back to the beginning of the Jewish nation, which goes back to Abraham, right? So what does Matthew do? He traces Jesus' genealogy all the way from Jesus to Abraham, okay? Actually from Abraham to Jesus. He goes in that order. Okay, so Matthew 1, verse 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and on and on and on until he gets all the way down to Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. Okay? Now, who's Luke writing to? Who's his audience? Gentiles. So, what do you think he might, let's just, brainstorm here a second. What is he trying to convince his readers of about Jesus? Say a little louder.
He's important to everyone.
He's important to everyone. That's a good answer. he's got to take Jesus. He can't just stop at Abraham. He's got to take Jesus all the way back to the beginning. He's got to show that Jesus is just not some fly-by-night religion that's just popped on the scene. He's got to trace Jesus all the way back to Adam, and that's what he does. So if you look at chapter 3, the second half of chapter 3 of Luke, you see that he begins with Jesus, who was a son, so it was thought of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Matthat, and he goes on, he starts with Jesus and he works backwards till he gets all the way to Adam, the Son of God. Okay? So his audience, this excellent Theophilus, he wants to make sure Theophilus knows that Jesus has some roots to him, okay, that go a long way back. All right? So that's an example of how the authors present something based on what their audience is. Okay? So when we read the Gospels, we have to kind of keep that in mind. All right? Now, let's kind of take what we've been talking about here, and let's talk about a certain seeming conflict in the Scriptures. And that is the incident of Jesus clearing the temple. Okay? Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, anybody know off the top of your head where that happens in the life of Jesus? When does he clear the temple? Early or late? Late, right after the triumphal entry. Okay? In fact, in Matthew and Luke, he comes in, he has this, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding on the donkey, and he immediately goes right to the temple area and clears the temple. Mark actually adds a day to that. He goes into the temple, takes a look around, goes back to Bethany, sleeps the night, comes back to Jerusalem, and clears the temple the next day. Okay? What does John do with that? What chapter is it in John? Chapter 2 of John. So the question is, in fact, let's look at John chapter 2. It's right after the first miracle that Jesus did where he changed water into wine. And then it says, after this he went down to Capernaum with his mother. This is verse 12 of John chapter 2. There they stayed a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" Okay? Now, what do we do with that? What are the options of way of looking at this apparent conflict? Therefore, if we get too tight about it, the only option we can really accept is that it happened twice. But from a logic standpoint, how many of you feel like it had to happen twice? It's just the way I worded that. Nobody's going to raise their hand, right? and you may want to raise your hand, that's fine. But from my standpoint, it's like that just doesn't make sense logically, Why would he do that twice? I mean, to me, it's more the second option makes more sense, that John's just not concerned about chronology. Okay, so he puts it earlier.
And if he did do it twice, why isn't it recorded twice in one particular gospel? Why doesn't Matthew say it twice, that he did it once here and then again later on?
Exactly. The very fact that none of the four Gospels record it as happening twice, each one recorded it happening once, albeit different stages of his ministry, is some evidence to say that it only happened once. It's not conclusive, obviously. Okay, but that's an apparent conflict that we don't have to throw the Bible out and say, it's got a bunch of errors, it's not worth reading, therefore I don't believe the Bible. We don't have to do that. We can say, look, we're not really sure why there's this conflict, but there is some logical explanations we can think of. There may be some other options that we don't even know of because we're 2,000 years down the road. We're not sure why that conflict occurs, but we're going to have to trust God that there's an explanation that's logical and doesn't challenge the inerrancy of the Scriptures. Okay. Now let's go back to the fact that Mark has he has a very similar account with Matthew and Luke, but he adds an extra day in there. He has Jesus going back to Bethany, probably to Lazarus' home, sleeping tonight, coming back to Jerusalem the next day and clearing the temple, where Matthew and Luke have him driving the people out of the temple right away. Does that challenge? Is there a third cleansing of the temple? He did it 2 days back to back? Nah, probably not. Okay, it's just that maybe Matthew and Luke didn't think it was important to chronologically to add that, to talk about that extra day, because it didn't add anything to what they were trying to present to their audience. So they left that little detail out because it's not important to them. But see, our problem is we think very linearly. We think, when we read the gospel, everything has to line up on a timeline, just like this. And they're not writing a timeline story necessarily of Jesus. They're giving big chunks of information to present different things about Jesus' life, different aspects of Jesus' life that they want their audience to know. For example, Mark, the first half of Mark has Jesus completely in the northern part of Palestine, in the Galilee area. The last half of Mark, he's all in Jerusalem, the last days of his life. Does that mean Jesus never went back and forth from Galilee to Jerusalem in his 3 years of ministry? Probably not. Jesus probably went to Jerusalem every time there was a major feast, a festival like Passover and some of the others, because that was required of Jewish men, that they would go to Jerusalem during those Passover time, those feast times. But Mark doesn't record that. Mark almost makes it sound like Jesus spent his whole first part of his ministry in Galilee and then came down to Jerusalem only in the last week or two of his life. Okay? Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay, let's move on to the next section of our notes. I've been thinking about this recently, about Jesus coming, and we're going to talk about him coming in the fullness of time. But you remember the story in Luke chapter 1 where Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah are at the temple. Now, Zechariah is at the temple as the high priest, and it's his turn, not the high priest, as a priest, and it's his turn, the lot's fallen on him to go into to make the sacrifice. And notice what Luke chapter 1 verse 6 and 7 says, is both Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were upright in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and regulations blamelessly. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well along in years. And if you look at the latter part of, verse 25, you know that her being barren was something was a disgrace in that culture. She was disgraced by the fact that she had no children at her age. And there was a cultural stigma attached to that. So Luke seems to be telling his audience, and therefore telling us in here, he seems to be making this point that they were very godly and upright people, yet God prevented her from having children. He points that out. Okay, but then we know the story goes on that the angel came to Zechariah and announces that Elizabeth will give birth to a son, and they are to name him John. He becomes John the Baptist. But the neat thing about that story, as I was just meditating on that, is that what it tells me is that God's timing is not our timing, and we could be very upright and godly people, and yet God may not use us exactly the way we think that he would use us because we're godly and upright people. He may actually put us on a shelf, so to speak, for a time, maybe all our life, because his plans are bigger than our plans. It doesn't mean he doesn't love us, He doesn't come and act on our behalf, but he may not necessarily use me in the ways that I wish that he would use me, in some grand scheme to advance his kingdom. Just because I'm a godly man and try to walk with him all my life, type of thing. But he may choose to someday down the line, 20 years, maybe tomorrow, sometime he may tap me on the shoulder or tap you on the shoulder and say, okay, here it goes. We got a big thing going on here, but he may not. And it's about him and his kingdom, yet he loves us and he cares for us. And so here's Elizabeth and Zechariah, clearly godly people, upright in his eyes. And for years he kept them on the shelf, so to speak. But now he's ready to act because he needs them to fulfill his kingdom purposes. So it's so much bigger than them. Yet Elizabeth was blessed by being used by God. Her disgrace was taken away from her. And I thought that was kind of neat. And it kind of leads us then to the very fact that Jesus, when he came in the fullness of time, you know. And in Galatians chapter 4, it talks about how we were slaves to our sin and stuff, and with no really way out. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we may receive the full rights of sons. So I want to talk about kind of that fullness of time from a historical perspective of when Jesus actually arrived on the scene. And when you look at all that was going along historically, politically, etc., you say, man, this was the ideal time for Jesus to arrive, for God to send his Son. So let's look at some historical considerations to help us realize that this is a good time in history for Jesus to come and for the spread of the gospel to make its impact on the world. First of all, we have to talk about two different empires that were at play at the time in the days leading up to Jesus. First of all was the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire was established by Alexander the Great when he conquered the Persian Empire around 330 BC. And if you go back in your Bible history, you remember during Isaiah's time, that's when the Assyrians took over the northern kingdom of Israel, took them captive. 100 and some years later, the Babylonian Empire then defeated the Assyrian Empire, and they took captive the southern half of Israel and took them captivity into Babylon. And then 70 years or more later, the Persian Empire arose and basically defeated the Babylonians, and they controlled this huge empire. And then the Greeks came, and Alexander the Greek was the one who came, and he had it in his mind to conquer the whole known world. So if you look here on the map, you'll see that this is basically the territory that Alexander the Greek conquered, all the way from Greece to India. Most of them known, well, it might be kind of ethnocentric to say the known civilized world, because there are other peoples, groups out there. This is basically the Western world that he conquered. And when he conquered this world, he brought with him the whole Greek culture. I mean, it was his plan to Hellenize, so to speak, this world, to bring Greek culture with him, and because they thought that was the most advanced culture there was. So this whole understanding of Hellenization took place with Alexander the Great. When he died in 323 BC, his kingdom divided, as you would expect. I mean, he has a huge, expansive kingdom. The main power broker dies. You got all these factions fighting for power and for control. Two of Alexander's top generals, Seleucus and Ptolemy, fought and gained control over two of the largest and most powerful portions of the Greek Empire. You can see here that the Seleucus and his people reigned basically through what's Iraq today and Syria, all the way into Greece. All right, here's Palestine. You know, there's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And the Ptolemy, his armies basically ruled in this region. Well, what's right between this Seleucus's region and Ptolemy's region? Israel, right? Has anybody ever played the game of Risk? If you've ever played the game of Risk, try to win the game by taking these territories. You're not going to win, okay? This is the crossroads between Africa and Europe, basically. You got to go through Palestine to get to Europe, or the other way around. And Ptolemy and his successors, and Seleucus and his successors, fought back and forth, for power, and Palestine was in the middle of that for years and years, going back and forth and back. Some years they would be under one control, and the other years they would be under somebody else, the Seleucus control, then the Ptolemies, and back and forth, and so they were never free. Okay, So the result was a period of really unrest and political instability in Palestine. And then about 168 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV desecrated the temple in Jerusalem and confiscated its treasures. The worship of Yahweh was abolished, and a statue of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, was installed in the temple. And many scholars, you go back to Daniel chapter 9 when it talks about the abomination which causes desolation. They see that as, the first fulfillment of that prophecy. And it seems, and Gary will probably expand on this in the Daniel Revelation class, it seems to me that there's at least two, maybe three fulfillments of that Daniel 9 prophecy. One here in 168 BC, one in 70 AD where the Romans desecrated the temple again, and perhaps a third one that's yet to come that many believe, okay? Of course, that would require that the temple get rebuilt, which I'm not sure that will happen, but maybe more, in a sense, in more of a spiritual realm type of understanding, that kind of desolation will occur. Okay, but that's way out of my area of expertise. That's for Gary. Ask Gary those questions. He's really good at those. Anyway, outraged by that action, Matthias, who was a priest in a town close to Jerusalem, right outside Jerusalem, refused to offer a heathen sacrifice and instead killed one of Antiochus's emissaries. When the news of that spread, it kind of sparked basically a revolution among the Jews. And many, known as the Hasidim, which means the pious ones, openly revolted against Antiochus. Led by Matthias' son Judas, who was nicknamed Maccabeus, which really means mallet head. Well, don't know how he got that, but anyway, they rebelled. The rebels were able to lay siege to Jerusalem and beat back the Seleucid legion. They were able to occupy the temple hill and reinstated the sacrifice to Yahweh. And then 3 years later, they were finally, they had enough control and enough restoration to the temple that they were able to light the temple lamps for the first time. And there's a whole tradition that goes along with it, that they only found enough oil to burn it for, I don't remember how long, but very short period of time. But miraculously, the oil held up and it stayed on for 7 days? Was that what it was? And that's where we get that's where Hanukkah comes from. There's a celebration of that miracle, okay? And that's why they light the menorah of the 7 candles. It's also known as the Festival of Lights. John chapter 10, verse 22 refers to it as the Feast of Dedication, which is another term for Hanukkah. But that's what Hanukkah celebrates, is that the Maccabees reestablishing the temple and lighting the lights and the candles in the temple. Okay, so if anybody asks you what does Hanukkah represent, it doesn't represent the Jewish Christmas, okay, because they don't have a Christmas. They don't believe in Christ. But it celebrates the Maccabees' defeat of Antiochus. Over time, the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, extended their control over much of Palestine. So from about 167 to 63 BC, Palestine enjoyed a time of religious and political independence. They kind of established themselves. They were finally their own nation for a while, a short period of time, about 100 years. Then we have the Roman Empire coming on the scene. Maccabean successors held political power as high priests and kings. In other words, the high priest was the king. When the high priest and king Alexander Jannaeus died in 76 BC, his wife took control of Palestine. Well, you could have a female king or queen, so to speak, but you can't have a female high priest for the Jews, okay? So she selected her son, Hyrcanus II, to become the high priest. The Pharisees supported her decision, but the Sadducees supported her other son, Aristobulus II, and a civil war ensued. Okay, obviously there's a lot more to this story than I'm giving you, but I'm just going to capsulize it for you. The expansion of the Roman Empire, meanwhile, was taking place. It had begun about 240 BC, And so by the 1st century, when this revolt, this civil war was happening, the Roman Empire had spread pretty much to the Palestine region. So while the Jews of Palestine were at war with each other, the Romans saw an opportunity to step in. Okay? The Roman commander Pompey sided with the Pharisees in favor of Hyrcanus as high priest. The supporters of Aristobulus isolated himself in the temple. In 63 BC, Pompey broke into the temple, dissolved the Maccabean reign, and added Jerusalem to the Roman province of Syria. Antipater, who was an Edomite, an Edomian, who supported Hyrcanus, was made king of Judah by the Romans. And by the way, Antipater was not a Jew. Okay, he was an Edomite. So he was made, the king over the Palestine region. Okay, he was made king of Judea. When Pompey died, Hyrcanus and Antipater aligned with Julius Caesar, but Antiochus, the son of Aristobulus, aligned with the Parthians, which were another. The Parthians basically had control in this region. Okay, kind of took over the Seleucid region. When Julius Caesar was assassinated in 444 BC, Mark Antony established Antipater's sons Phasael and Herod as tetrarchs of Judah. In 40 BC, Antigonus, I'll get that pronounced right, with help from the Parthians, attacked Jerusalem, forcing Herod to take refuge. Hyrcanus was taken prisoner and Phasael committed suicide. Later, Herod escaped to Rome. In Rome, he was appointed king of the Jews. He marshaled 2 legions of soldiers and in 37 BC expelled the Parthians from Jerusalem. He reigned from 37 BC until he died in 4 BC. Okay, that's Herod, known as Herod the Great, the king of the Jews. Okay, and so let's think about that for a little bit. First of all, it tells us, I'm going to skip here. This is basically his territory, the purple that Herod the Great was the king of. Okay, Herod the Great was the king that was alive when Jesus was born, and the Magi came from the east and came to Jerusalem, and they wanted to know where this new baby, the king of the Jews, was born. Now, can you imagine what that sounded like to Herod, who is the official king of the Jews, to have these Magi saying, we're looking for the new king of the Jews that's being born? It didn't really make him very happy, okay? So you could see why he laid plans out for them to find out where he was and come back and report to him, because his plan was to go and kill the baby Jesus so that he could not become the king of the Jews, because he was, okay? Because Herod was. Now, having said all that, when did Herod the Great die? 4 BC. We know that pretty accurately, okay? So that means Jesus must have been born before 4 BC, okay? So our calendars are wrong, okay? And but when they came up with the calendar that we use now to measure AD, BC, they were just not, they didn't have the historical data to know exactly the dates that Herod died to frame that. So the question is okay, when was Jesus born? Well, he probably wasn't born 4 BC. He was probably born a year or two at least before Herod died. Remember, Herod sent soldiers to kill all the babies in Bethlehem area from age 0 to age 2. Now you could say, well, that means that Jesus was 2 years old by then. Well, maybe not. Maybe Herod was just doing overkill. He said, I'm going to just make sure that they're all dead. Just to be sure. Okay, so Jesus could have been anywhere from age 0 to age 2 when that happened, which is who knows when that happened. But so scholars tend to want to think that Jesus might have been born somewhere between 6 and 7 BC. Okay. It's hard to really know for sure. At the end of the class today, the last thing we'll do in the class is we'll look at at the excursus at the end of our notes here that gives us the whole Herod family tree, and it'll be really interesting to you because there's lots of times that Herod is mentioned in the Bible, but they're not always the same Herod, okay? And it's really important to distinguish them, and it's kind of fascinating. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So the first consideration we want to talk about as far as this being the fullness of time is that we've got these two historical kingdoms that established themselves: the Greeks, and then the Romans. And we'll see in a moment why that's important. Okay, so let's go on to the political considerations on the bottom of page 11 in your notes. The first political consideration we want to talk about is the Roman rule, the Israelites being ruled by the Romans. Beginning with the rule of Augustus Caesar in 27 BC and lasting for almost 200 years, the Romans ruled most of the civilized world of the Mediterranean basin. Up until Augustus, Caesars came and gone, and there was a lot of turmoil in the Roman Empire. It wasn't just a well-established, firm kingdom that just marched itself across. I mean, there was lots of power plays going on among the Roman rulers. But Augustus was pretty much able to consolidate power there. And so during his time, mainly because he had a pretty well-established, loyal army, there was lots of peace at that time, okay? It was called Pax Romana. And it was a peace that was maintained by a large, well-organized army. Roman policies toward religions and customs of conquered people were relatively tolerant. The Romans welcomed new gods. They were polytheistic. The more gods, the better. So if we conquer a land and they got some new gods there, we'll just absorb them into our mythology of our gods, and we'll be happy about that. Many of the gods of other nations were basically the same gods that they've had, they just with different names, okay? If you've ever studied Roman mythology and Greek mythology, you say these are just different names for the same concept of this particular type of god, and you know how many different gods that they believed in. So the more the better. So they're very tolerant of other religions. However, the Jews resisted that because they were monotheistic. Okay. So while enjoying peace and political stability under the rule of the Romans, the Jews rejected the polytheistic ways of the Romans. They insisted on remaining monotheistic in their worship of Yahweh. Furthermore, the Jews resisted the growing worship of Caesar, okay, which was beginning to become more and more prevalent. When Jesus was a boy, an uprising occurred against Archelaus, Herod's son. The Roman soldiers were called in, and a city near Nazareth was destroyed. This is the rebellion that Gamaliel refers to in Acts chapter 5. Now, let me just read that to you. Acts chapter 5, around verse 37. Let's just back it up, verse 33, get the context. When they heard this, they were furious, wanted to put them to death. Back it up to verse 29 so we get this. Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised Jesus from the dead, whom you've killed by hanging him on a tree. God exalted him to his own right hand as Prince and Savior, that he might give repentance and forgiveness of sins to Israel. We are witnesses of these things, and so is the Holy Spirit, whom God has given to those who obey him." When they heard this, the leaders, the Pharisees, they were furious and wanted to put them to death. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed them, "Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, and all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered." And that's That's the revolt that happened when Jesus was just a young boy. So there was this kind of this continuous resistance to the Romans that some of the Jews, had. Some of it was very outward. Some of it was kind of, underground. It's kind of an insurgency, so to speak. So the resistance by the Zealot party continued until the great rebellion that broke out in 66 AD. Once again, the Roman legions were summoned in, and in 70 AD they took Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And several years later, the last remnant of the Jewish resistance who had fled Jerusalem to the rock fortress of Masada were conquered. So what happened in 66 BC, the Zealot party really revolted against the Romans. The Romans said, okay, we've had enough of this. They came in, drove them out of Jerusalem, and it wasn't a pretty sight doing that. They actually laid siege to Jerusalem. Many were starved, and then in 70 AD, the temple was completely destroyed. Some of the Jewish people, leaders, and were able to break through the walls in Jerusalem and flee to the south to Masada, which is right next to the Dead Sea. And Masada is kind of like this rock fortress. It's kind of a high plateau that Herod the Great had actually had a palace set up there, and it was just almost impenetrable. Once you got there, there's only one way up, then you could defend it very easily. Well, the Romans basically laid siege to Masada and built a siege ramp up to it, and eventually were overtook. I think the Jews, if I remember right, they killed themselves. They committed suicide before the Romans got there. But that was the end of the revolt, the 70 AD type of revolt. Okay, I tell you what. Let's take a break, and then we'll finish up when we get back. Okay, we're going to pick up here on at the bottom of page 13 under cultural considerations. But before I do, I want to address a question that was raised because it's a good question, and see if I can get a decent answer for it, at least my thinking on the answer. The question was, if Matthew, let's assume Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, and he was an eyewitness, and then Mark was writing his account basically based on oral tradition or oral testimony given to him by Peter, who was an eyewitness. Why wouldn't their two accounts be very, very similar, almost identical, if one was an eyewitness and the other one is writing based on an eyewitness account? Why do we have to say that Matthew borrowed from Mark? I think I've got the question right. My answer to that is that it comes basically in the words of Jesus. Because if Jesus spoke in Aramaic, but the New Testament Gospels are all written in Greek, how in the world could both of them be translated exactly the same word for word in the Greek? You know what I'm saying? If let's say I was an eyewitness and I heard somebody, I was bilingual, and I heard somebody speak words in, let's say, Spanish, and I know Spanish, and I translated them into English. Somebody else translated those words into English. Do you think those two English translations would be identical word for word? Very rare, okay? But yet they are. At many points in the gospel, not always, not 100%, but almost 90% of the time in the parallel passages, Jesus' words are almost lined up in the Greek identically. So that's really hard to say anything other than they had to have the same source. Okay, page 13. We've talked about some considerations to help us see that this is an ideal time for Jesus to arrive on the scene. I'm sorry, we're not on page 13, we're on page 12. We just talked about the Jewish resistance, so we want to talk about the Jewish sects that were all part of the political situation at the time. Okay, you had the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the party of the populace. They weren't necessarily popular with the people, but they more identified, they lived among the people, okay? They did not enjoy the material benefits of the Roman rule, and resisted the Hellenization that the Romans sought to continue. The Pharisees were, the keepers of the law. They wanted to make sure they were very pure with the Old Testament law. They took all the laws of Moses, and they thought of every circumstances that might happen. Say, for example, what would happen on the Sabbath if this happened? Okay, what if my TV didn't get turned off before the Sabbath started? Is it okay for me to turn my TV off, or does that work? And they had all these rules about what is work and what's not work on the Sabbath. You laugh at that, but that actually happened to a friend of mine. He lived in an apartment complex where the people below him were Orthodox Jews, and this was in New Orleans. And one Sunday, or maybe it was Saturday night, they knocked on the door of his apartment. They'd walked up the steps and knocked on his door to ask him if he could come down and turn their TV off, because they didn't get turned off before the Sabbath. The Sabbath starts at sunset on Saturday night, okay? So they walked all the way up the steps to ask him to come down to turn their TV off, Another day, the husband was driving home, and the sun set before he got home. He just pulled the car off the side of the road. This is in New Orleans. You just don't do this, and expect your car to be there the next day. And he walked home, because he couldn't drive on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees were notorious about, making sure they knew all the rules of when you could do different things in order to keep the law to its purest form, okay? Because they were just passionate about keeping God's laws. We like to talk badly about the Pharisees because Jesus, attacks them so much. But, we tend to be very much like the Pharisees because we want to be holy and right before God. And we can fall into some of the same traps they do in our legalism as we do that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be holy and righteous, but we have to be careful what our holiness and our righteousness is based on. But the Pharisees believed in a final resurrection, and they also believed in the existence of angels. And believe it or not, these were kind of novel concepts back in Jesus' in the New Testament days. These were not well-developed theologies coming out of the Old Testament, the faith of the Jews. Okay, so those concepts of like a final resurrection of the dead were rejected by the Sadducees. And of course, I've got to say, you understand why they were sad, you see. Because, sorry, I had to say it. Anyway, so let's talk about the Sadducees. They were more conservative than the Pharisees. The Sadducees belonged to the Jewish aristocracy. Okay? They held, in other words, they're more conservative in that they didn't hold to some of these new novel ideas, okay? Like angels and stuff like that. I don't know how the Sadducees could not see angels in the Old Testament, but they somehow didn't. Okay, they enjoyed favor with the Romans. They kind of sided with the Romans, especially the Roman authorities. The Sadducees were mostly associated with the functions of the temple. They were the aristocracy of the Jews, and they didn't really, humble themselves down to the level of your common person. Okay. After the fall of the temple in 70 AD, the Sadducees lost their reason for being, and they pretty much disappeared from history. Then you had the Zealot party, and now scholars argue whether or not that was really an organized party, a sect, or if they were just zealots, that were out there, maybe many factions. Okay, and we see that in modern days when you see the insurgencies in different countries rising up. They're not always an autonomous force. They have lots of different competing interests. So the Zealots of that day might have been very similar. But they opposed Roman rule. They were trying to get the Romans out of there. Apparently Simon, one of the disciples, the 12 disciples of Jesus, came from that party because they called him Simon the Zealot. Okay, so at least in his past, before he became an apostle, he must have been fairly closely aligned with those who opposed the Roman rule. Then you had the Essene sect, which really isn't referred to directly in the Gospels, but there's kind of an indirect inference to them when you talk about John the Baptist. The Essenes were an ascetic sect that, and there were probably many groups like them, that they sought to obey the law by withdrawing from society. In particular, they withdrew from Roman influence, so the Essenes kind of withdrew from the civilization and became their own little ascetic sect, kind of very similar to the in the early church days of the Roman church, and you had the monasteries that popped up, the monks that said, we're not going to be secularized, we're going to remain true to our faith and our lifestyle as being Christians that walk closely with God, and we hold ourselves to high holy values, and so they separated themselves and went into their monasteries. The Essenes were similar to that. The Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, are attributed to the Essenes. In other words, when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls early in mid 20th century in the caves in the Qumran area, which is close to the Dead Sea, they pretty much figure it was the Essenes that had kept those scrolls and had preserved them. Okay, Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way, just kind of as a tangent, are very, very important to scholars because they contain some of the oldest copies of the Old Testament that we have. And they were just fragments of the Old Testament. It wasn't the complete Old Testament that they found. They did find a complete book of the book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is very important to scholars. Okay, so we had some historical considerations. We have some political situations set up to make this the fullness of time. Now let's talk about the cultural, which really kind of ties all this together, okay? Pax Romana made it possible for the good news of Jesus Christ to travel the world quickly. And three major factors were in place. First of all, there was a common language. This is why we talked about the Greek Empire. When the Greeks came and they Hellenized the world, they brought the Greek language with them. And almost everybody in that world spoke the Greek language, okay? And it wasn't the classical Greek that Homer and the Iliad and all that was written, which is a very complicated Greek language. That's a much earlier Greek than what was spoken in Jesus' day. In Palestine. What was spoken in Jesus' day was known as Koine Greek, and that's what the New Testament was written in. And Koine Greek is not a Holy Spirit language that some people think. Okay, it was just a common, everyday working man's language. It was a very simplified version of Greek, so that these fishermen in Galilee could easily learn it and trade their fish with other merchants. Okay. And so it was just a simplified Greek language that all the merchants spoke, and they were able to communicate and sell their goods to each other. So you had that in place where you had this whole Mediterranean basin all speaking the Greek. They all understood a common language, all right? And then you had the diaspora, which refers to the Jews who were dispersed throughout the known world for many different reasons. You had the Assyrian captivity, then later the Babylonian captivity, where Jews were taken into all parts of the world, and then some of them just immigrated out of Palestine for different reasons, natural immigration. But that dispersion of the Jewish people was referred to as the diaspora. As the Jews traveled from their lands back to Jerusalem for various festivals, they took Christ with them. When they come back to the Passover, they heard about Jesus. They take it back with them to the lands that they live in. So very quickly, the message of Jesus spread from Jerusalem outwardly because of just the natural travel of the Jews back and forth, coming to the different festivals to Jerusalem, back to their lands where they were. And then they had very good trade routes. They were able to travel freely and quickly because the Greeks and the Romans had established really good trade routes with roads that were well-traveled, well-established, and relatively safe, relatively, okay, and because of the Roman control. These trade routes, whether by sea or by road, aided in the quick spread of the gospel. So you have all these things working together for that God say, okay, this is the time I'm going to send my son into the world. And very quickly, once the church was established, the gospel started going out. It spread very quickly. Okay? So that's what I mean by the fullness of time. Now, to finish off tonight, I want to just kind of backtrack and look at page 17 in your notes, or 15 in your notes, excuse me, at the Herod family tree, okay, because I think you'll find this fascinating. So, you might want to actually kind of turn to page 16 and just flip back and forth from 15 to 16 as I read through this. On the top of the family tree, you have Antipater, whose sons were Phasael and Herod the Great. Remember, Phasael was committed suicide early on. Herod the Great was, fled to Rome and then was established by the Caesar there as being the king of the Jews. He came back to Judea and established his kingdom with some legions of Roman soldiers. Herod had 5 sons, okay? So let's go through each one of these. First of all, let's back up to Herod the Great. Herod the Great held the title of King of the Jews and reigned from 37 BC to his death in 4 BC. We've talked about that. During his reign, he began an ambitious project to restore the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, that project continued on after his death and was continuing even, when Jesus gave his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, they're working on this temple restoration. And the disciples point to the temple and, point out its magnificence, and Jesus said, destroy this and I'll build it in 3 days, referring to his own body. And then he goes on to talk about the end times because they say, well, tell us when all this is going to happen. So he gives us all of the discourse. We'll look at that in detail in a later class. But Herod ordered all the boys 2 years and younger killed in the area of Bethlehem in order to kill the baby Jesus. You remember that? And so then after the death of Herod, his kingdom was divided by Caesar Augustus between his full brothers, Archelaus and Antipas, and their half-brother Philip. Archelaus was made governor of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, which is this area. Okay, so that's Archelaus. He ruled until he was deposed in 6 AD. He wasn't very popular. After Archelaus, Judea was ruled by procurators, which were just another name for Roman administrators. They weren't kings, so to speak, but they were administrators. Pontius Pilate was the 5th such procurator. Festus and Felix, which are found in the book of Acts, were also among Judean procurators. When Joseph and Mary and Jesus returned from Egypt, you remember they fled to Egypt because they had been warned in a dream not to stay in Bethlehem because Herod the Great wanted to kill the baby, so they fled to Egypt. When Herod died and Joseph was going to bring Jesus and Mary back to Palestine from Egypt, he was warned in a dream to bypass this, not go back to Bethlehem. There's Jerusalem, there's Bethlehem. Not to go back to Bethlehem, but instead go back to Nazareth, okay, and settle there because of Archelaus, Herod's son. They were afraid, that he would carry out the killing of Jesus, okay, and Archelaus didn't rule in Galilee, okay. Antipas was made the tetrarch over Galilee and Perea. He was the Herod who had John the Baptist beheaded. Antipas married Herodias, who was the wife of Herod, who is called Philip in the Gospels. I know this gets confusing, but I'll let you study it on your own because it's fascinating. But so let's see if we can kind of set this up. You have Herod. Archelaus is the one who is the king of Judea. Okay, and then Antipas is made king of Galilee area. And maybe I can just set this in your mind if you're not familiar with the geography of Palestine. I'll give you a little way to remember this. Let's say this part of the room is the northern part of Palestine called Galilee, around the Sea of Galilee. Okay? And this part of the room, over to this side is Judea, which is the southern part, okay? And that's where Jerusalem is, and east of that you got the Dead Sea. What connects the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea? Jordan River, right? And which way does the Jordan River flow? North to south, right? From Galilee to the Dead Sea, all right? Why is it called the Dead Sea? There's nothing, it's no outlet, so all the water that goes in has to evaporate to get out and leaves all the minerals behind, and basically over time that fills, those minerals build up, so it kills everything in it. So it's the Dead Sea. Sea of Galilee has an outlet, Jordan River, okay? Now, you've got Galilee, you've got Judea. What's between? Samaria. There's some area between Galilee and Judea. All right? Yeah. All right. So Antipas is the king of Galilee. He marries Herodias. But who is Herodias? Well, Herodias was the wife of Antipas' half-brother, Herod Philip. Okay? But Herodias is also the daughter of Antipas' brother. So Antipas actually married his niece and his sister-in-law. You ever heard the country western song? How's that go? I'm my own grandpa, something like that. Okay, it gets even more convoluted. Okay, because the daughter of Herod, Philip, and Herodias is Salome, or Salome, or however you want to say it. Salome marries her uncle, another Philip. Okay. All right, so let's talk about, go back to Antipas. Antipas was the tetrarch over Galilee and Perea, and he was the one, you remember, he married Herodias. John the Baptist called him on it because he basically took his brother's wife to be his, and he said that's immoral, and Herodias wasn't too happy about that, so when the opportune time came, she arranged for Salome to ask for John the Baptist's head on the platter, and that's what happened. Remember, Salome had danced in front of Antipas, Herod Antipas, and he said, hey, you did such a great job. Anything up to half the kingdom is yours. And so she runs to her mother and says, what shall I ask for? And she says, ask for John the Baptist's head, So she does, and Antipas relents to do that, kills John the Baptist, etc. Okay. Antipas reigned in Galilee when Jesus was ministering there. During Jesus' trial, in fact, one place in the Gospels it says that Herod tried to have Jesus killed. That's Herod Antipas. Okay. During Jesus' trial, Pilate sent him to Antipas when he heard that Jesus was a Galilean. He said, "Oh, you're from Galilee. Well, you come under Herod Antipas's jurisdiction." So, and he just happens to be in town right now, probably because it was Passover time, etc. So, not that he was a Jew, but it's a place to be at that time. It's where all good politicians are. So he sends him over to Antipas, and Antipas can't find anything. He doesn't say anything to Antipas. And so, if you remember the movie, what was the movie? The Passion of the Christ. They make Antipas out to be a real kind of effeminate type of king, So that's the person we're talking about here. Philip, the third son of Herod the Great, became the tetrarch over Galantis, Trachonitis, I can't pronounce these, etc. And he basically is not, his rule is pretty peaceful. He's kind of uneventful. His claim to fame is that he built a city named Caesar Philippi, which he basically named it after himself in Caesar, and then he married Salome, the daughter of his half-brother Herod Philip. Okay, and then there's another Herod called Philip in the Gospels who was a half-brother. He was the husband, the first husband of Salome. He didn't rule over anything. He lived in one of the coastal cities, but his wife was Herodias, and we already talked about that. Herodias as we said, it was actually the daughter of Aristobulus. Her brother was Agrippa the First. Agrippa the First was the grandson of Herod the Great and the brother of Herodias. Their father was Aristobulus. Agrippa the First inherited the territory of Philip the Tetrarch and later added Judea and Samaria to his rule. He is known in the New Testament as the Herod who persecuted the Jerusalem church in the book of Acts. And you remember, he's the one that kind of, they began to worship him, and he accepted their worship, and God killed him by, afflicting him with worms. You remember that? That's Agrippa the First, who was the brother of Herodias. Okay? Agrippa the Second was the son of Agrippa the First. He took over the territory that was once ruled by Philip and then his father, and also parts of Galilee. He is the Agrippa that heard Paul's case when Paul was on trial in Acts chapter 25 and 26. Bernice was Agrippa's second sister and the daughter of Agrippa the First. She married her uncle Herod of Challis. Okay? Bernice traveled with her brother Agrippa II when they heard Paul's case, so she was there too. Felix, who is also found in Acts chapter 23 and 24, was the husband of Drusilla, who is a sister of Agrippa II. Okay? In other words, Drusilla is here, basically a sister of Bernice. She married Felix. Felix was one of the Roman procurators of Judea and was the first to hear Paul when he was on trial. So all these guys tie in together in the book of Acts. They're all related either by marriage or by blood, in usually 2 or 3 different ways, okay, to Herod the Great. All right, so when you see the word Herod in the Gospels in the book of Acts, it's not always the same Herod, the same guy. Well, it was Herod the Great's name, and then subsequent people, his sons, continued that name because of its significance. That was very common in those days to do that, to maintain the name of a forefather that was powerful. Oh, I want to point out one more thing. I don't know if you noticed, but Salome later married Aristobulus. Okay, so probably a first cousin twice removed or something like that. I don't know how it works, but so Herodias and Salome, they kind of got around, But you kind of wonder how many heads their kids had, and how many fingers and toes they had, because a lot of intermarriage. So, all right, that's it for the night. Let's just close with some prayer and ask God to bless us this week, and we'll see you back next week.